At the end of the 18th century, if you had to bet on which country would dominate East Asia 100 years later, China would have looked like the obvious choice. It was one of the largest empires on Earth. Hundreds of millions of people lived under its rule. Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain were sold across the world, and European merchants were willing to send enormous amounts of silver to get them. In 1793, a British diplomat named Lord Macartney traveled halfway around the world to meet the Chinese emperor. Britain wanted more ports, easier trade, and a permanent diplomatic presence. Most of those requests were rejected. From the Chinese court's point of view, Britain was the country asking for access. Japan looked very different. It was much smaller. Political power was still divided between the Tokugawa shogunate and regional domains, and the country had spent more than 2 centuries tightly restricting most foreign contact. Then, in 1853, 4 American warships entered Edo Bay. Commodore Matthew Perry came with steam-powered ships, modern guns, and a demand that Japan open its ports. The Japanese government understood the problem immediately. It could say no. It probably could not stop the ships. Now, jump forward just 42 years. In 1895, Japanese officials were no longer negotiating with Western gunboats outside Tokyo. They were imposing terms on China. Japan had defeated the Qing Empire on land and at sea. China was forced to give up Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, abandon its old position in Korea, and pay an enormous indemnity. The reversal was extraordinary. China had begun the century as the larger, richer, more powerful state. Japan had been the country forced open by foreign warships. Yet by the end of the century, Japan had become the military power defeating China. And the easy explanation doesn't really work. It wasn't simply that Japan modernized while China refused to change. China bought modern rifles. It built arsenals and shipyards. It created new armies. It purchased some of the most powerful warships in East Asia. It sent students and officers overseas to learn. China was trying to modernize too. So the real question is not why Japan modernized and China didn't. It's why 2 old Asian states, confronted by the same new industrial world, produced such different results. Why did Japan become strong enough to defeat China, while China kept losing ground? To understand that, we have to go back to the moment when China's old position in Asia still looked secure. The story begins with something Britain wanted from China far more than China wanted anything from Britain: tea. By the early 1800s, it had become part of everyday life in Britain. It was no longer something reserved for wealthy families. People across British society were drinking it, and almost all of it came from China. Then there was silk, porcelain. Other Chinese goods Europeans were happy to buy. The problem was what Britain could sell back. British wool and manufactured goods found some customers in China, but nowhere near enough to pay for everything British merchants were buying. So much of the difference had to be settled in silver. Ship after ship arrived for Chinese goods, and British merchants kept sending precious metal in the other direction. For Britain, that was becoming an expensive trade. Then, British-controlled India offered a way around it. The British East India Company controlled a huge opium production and auction system there. Private merchants could buy the drug in India, carry it toward China, and sell it into a market where demand was growing quickly. There was one obvious problem. Opium was illegal in China. So this was not normal trade. Large foreign ships often stayed offshore. Smaller vessels and Chinese smugglers moved the drug toward the coast, where networks of merchants carried it farther inland. And the business was extremely profitable. Chinese buyers paid for opium with silver. That silver could move back through the trading system and help British merchants buy more Chinese tea. The trade problem Britain had struggled with was beginning to reverse. For the Qing government, the consequences were much harder to ignore. Opium use was spreading beyond wealthy consumers. Officials complained about addiction among government employees and soldiers, including men who were supposed to defend the empire. At the same time, large amounts of silver were leaving through the trade. That mattered for reasons that went far beyond merchants. Much of everyday life in China ran on copper cash, but important taxes were assessed in silver. When silver became more expensive relative to copper, a farmer or ordinary taxpayer needed more copper coins just to obtain the same amount of silver required for taxes. Something that had begun as a British trade problem was now reaching into the Qing tax system. And because the trade was illegal, it created another problem. A business this large could not operate inside China without Chinese participation. Smugglers needed landing points, merchants needed distribution networks. Local officials could make money simply by deciding not to see what was happening. The more profitable the trade became, the harder it was for Beijing to enforce its own ban. By the 1830s, the Qing court was arguing over what to do. Some officials thought prohibition had already failed. If opium could not actually be stopped, they argued, perhaps legalizing and taxing it would give the government more control. Others saw that as surrender. Foreign merchants had built an illegal business. Chinese smugglers and corrupt officials had helped it spread. And now the government was being asked to change its own law because enforcing it had become too difficult. Lin Zexu belonged firmly to the second group. His argument hit the court where it hurt most. The country was losing silver. Opium was spreading through society, and even parts of the military were being affected. The Daoguang emperor finally decided to act. In 1839, he sent Lin to Canton with unusually broad authority. Lin did not arrive looking for a compromise that would keep the opium business running. He ordered the foreign merchants to surrender their stock. They resisted. So, Lin increased the pressure. Foreign merchants were confined to the trading area, normal business was disrupted, and it became clear that trade would not simply continue while they refused to hand over the drug. Eventually, they gave in. More than 20,000 chests of opium were surrendered, well over 1,000 tons. Lin had the cargo taken to Human. There, workers opened the chests and emptied the opium into large pits. They mixed it with water, salt, and lime, breaking it down before the waste was flushed away. It took weeks. This was not a ceremonial bonfire. The Qing government was destroying an enormous stockpile of merchandise worth a fortune. Lin also sent a letter addressed to Queen Victoria. His basic argument was simple. If Britain would not tolerate a destructive drug being sold to its own people, why should British merchants be allowed to profit from selling one in China? To Lin, this was a question of law and sovereignty. The drug was banned. Foreign merchants had violated that ban. Now the Chinese government was enforcing it. But in Britain, the same event looked very different. British merchants had just lost a huge amount of valuable property. And behind that dispute sat a much larger argument that had been building for years. Who got to decide how Britain traded with China? The Qing government believed foreign commerce took place under Chinese rules. Britain increasingly refused to accept that arrangement. The argument moved from Canton to London, and then from London to the Royal Navy. In 1840, British warships appeared off the Chinese coast. On paper, the comparison looked strange. China had hundreds of millions of people. The Qing could field far more soldiers than Britain could possibly send halfway around the world. But Britain did not need to defeat all of them. China had thousands of miles of coastline. British ships could choose where to attack. They could move along the coast, enter rivers, threaten one position, then shift somewhere else before the Qing could move large armies across the empire. Steam power made some British vessels less dependent on wind. Modern naval artillery gave them another advantage. Many Qing forts could fire back, but fixed coastal defenses had to wait for the enemy to come within useful range. The British could often choose the distance and direction of the fight. The Qing Empire's enormous size gave it manpower. It also gave the Royal Navy an enormous number of places to attack. British forces moved north along the coast. They entered important waterways. Eventually, they threatened the lower Yangtze, one of the richest parts of the empire and a region the government could not afford to lose control of. By 1842, the court decided to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanjing ended the war. China had to open 5 ports to British trade. It had to pay 21 million silver dollars. And Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain. 3 years earlier, the Qing government had been trying to stop an illegal drug trade inside its own territory. Now, a foreign power had used military force to change the conditions under which it traded with China. But this is where the story is easy to oversimplify. China had lost a war. China had not collapsed. The Qing still controlled an enormous country. It still had hundreds of millions of people, major commercial cities, agricultural wealth, and a government capable of collecting taxes and ruling most of the empire. What Britain had done was expose a weakness that had been much harder to see in 1793. China's size alone could not protect it from industrial military power. The warning had arrived. The important question was what China would do with it. And before that question could really be answered, the settlement Britain had just forced on China began creating new problems of its own. The Treaty of Nanjing had opened 5 ports, but the treaty itself was only the beginning. Additional agreements soon gave Britain rights that reached much deeper into how those ports actually worked. One of the most important was extraterritoriality. If a British subject was accused of certain crimes in China, the case could be handled through the British consular system, rather than an ordinary Qing court. That sounds like a technical legal detail. In practice, it meant something much bigger. Foreign merchants could live and do business inside Chinese territory while remaining partly outside the legal authority of the Chinese state. And once Britain had obtained those privileges, other countries wanted similar ones. The treaty ports became permanent footholds. Foreign merchants arrived, consuls arrived, missionaries arrived, warehouses, shipping firms, and foreign communities grew around the ports. The Qing had lost the war in 1842, but the consequences of that defeat were still expanding years later, and Britain wanted more. British officials and merchants pushed for wider access to the Chinese market and revisions to the existing treaty system. The next confrontation came in 1856, and it began with a very small ship, the Arrow. The Arrow was a Chinese-owned vessel that had been associated with British registration in Hong Kong. Chinese officials boarded it near Canton and arrested members of its Chinese crew. British authorities argued that Qing officials had violated British rights connected to the ship, but the legal situation was messy. The vessel's British registration had expired, and exactly what protections it was entitled to was disputed. That did not stop the incident from becoming politically useful. Britain had already been pushing for greater access to China. Now it had a confrontation it could use to apply military pressure again. France soon joined. Its government had its own grievance after a French Catholic missionary, Auguste Chapdelaine, was executed by Chinese authorities in Guangxi. What began around Canton was becoming another international war, and this time the fighting would go much farther. British and French forces attacked Qing positions in the south. They moved along the coast. They attacked the forts guarding the route toward northern China. The Qing resisted, negotiated, rejected agreements, and fought again. By 1860, British and French forces were moving toward Beijing. This was already far worse than what had happened in the First War. The emperor was no longer dealing with foreign ships threatening distant ports. Foreign troops were approaching the imperial capital itself. The Xianfeng Emperor left Beijing and fled north to the imperial hunting retreat at Rehe. The court that had rejected Macartney's requests less than 70 years earlier was now abandoning its own capital as European armies approached. And outside Beijing stood one of the greatest symbols of Qing imperial power, the Old Summer Palace. It was not one building. It was an enormous complex of gardens, lakes, halls, libraries, temples, pavilions, and imperial residences developed over generations. Inside were paintings, books, porcelain, furniture, clocks, precious objects, and collections accumulated from across China and abroad. When British and French troops reached the complex in October of 1860, they began looting it. Soldiers moved through rooms filled with imperial possessions. Small objects disappeared into pockets and bags. Larger objects were carried away. Some were sold. Some went home with officers and soldiers. Others eventually entered private collections and museums overseas. But the story did not end with looting. During negotiations, a group of British, French, and Indian prisoners had been captured by Qing forces. Some were tortured. A number died in captivity. The British commander Lord Elgin decided on a retaliation meant to punish the imperial court directly. He ordered the Old Summer Palace burned. British troops set fire to the complex. The flames spread through halls and residences that had taken generations to build. Smoke rose outside Beijing for days. The symbolism was almost impossible to miss. In 1793, Lord Macartney had traveled to China, carrying gifts and asking the Qing emperor for greater access to trade. 67 years later, British soldiers were outside Beijing, burning one of the emperor's greatest palace complexes. The Qing had to negotiate again. The settlements that ended the conflict expanded foreign access much further. More ports were opened. Foreign diplomats were allowed to live permanently in Beijing. Missionaries received broader protections. Foreign commercial access increased. The opium trade Lin Zexu had tried to suppress was now effectively brought into the legal trading system, and the Qing had to pay more indemnities. The important thing is what did not happen. The losses from the First War did not disappear when the Second War began. Hong Kong was still British. The treaty ports were still open. Foreign legal privileges were still there. The second defeat did not replace the first settlement. It added another layer on top of it. If this had been China's only problem, the story might have developed very differently. A government can lose a war and still rebuild. Japan would prove that later. It would be forced to open its ports, suffer unequal treaty restrictions of its own, and still find enough political space to remake the state. China's problem was that its external crisis was arriving at almost exactly the same moment as a catastrophe inside the country. While British and French troops were advancing toward Beijing, the Qing government was fighting another enemy hundreds of miles to the south. That enemy did not control a few villages. It controlled cities. It collected taxes. It appointed officials. It commanded enormous armies. And 7 years before foreign troops reached the Old Summer Palace, it had captured Nanjing and turned one of China's greatest cities into the capital of a rival state. This was the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and its leader did not begin as a general. Hong Xiuquan began as a man trying to enter the Qing system. He came from southern China and repeatedly took the civil service examinations, the tests that could turn an educated man into a government official. He failed, again and again. After one of those failures, Hong became seriously ill and experienced a series of strange visions. Later, after reading Christian religious material brought into China by missionaries, he came to a remarkable conclusion. He believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. That sounds like the beginning of a small religious sect. It did not stay small. Hong's message spread through parts of southern China at a moment when the region was already under enormous pressure. There were poor farmers, displaced workers, people angry at local officials, communities dealing with economic disruption, population pressure, and the after-effects of the Opium War. For many of them, Hong was offering more than religion. He was offering a different social order. The movement grew. Then it became an army. In 1853, Taiping forces captured Nanjing. This was not some remote provincial town. Nanjing sat on the Yangtze River and was one of the great cities of China. Hong's followers turned it into the capital of their own state. They collected taxes. They appointed officials. They controlled territory. They commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. For the Qing court, this was no longer a rebellion somewhere on the edge of the empire. There was now a rival government sitting inside one of China's richest regions. And that location mattered. The Yangtze Valley was full of productive farmland, commercial cities, transport routes, and taxpayers. This was one of the places the Qing government depended on for money. Now armies were moving through it year after year. Cities changed hands. Trade routes were disrupted. Fields were abandoned. Local tax collection became harder in places that had turned into battlefields. And the human cost was staggering. No exact figure exists, but estimates for deaths connected to the Taiping War often reach roughly 20 to 30 million people. This was happening while the Qing was also fighting foreign armies. That is the situation Beijing faced in the 1850s. British and French forces were attacking from outside. The Taiping were taking territory from inside, and the military system the Qing already had was struggling with both. On paper, the dynasty possessed enormous armed forces. There were the banner armies. There was the Green Standard Army. There were units spread across a huge empire. But a large number on a military register did not automatically produce an effective army in the field. Training varied badly. Readiness varied. Corruption had weakened some units. Many formations had spent years performing garrison and policing duties rather than fighting a civil war on this scale. The Qing needed forces that could actually stop the Taiping, and one of the men who would build them did not look much like a military strongman. Zheng Guofan was a scholar. He had succeeded in the same examination system Hong Xiuquan had repeatedly failed. He entered the bureaucracy, rose through the government, and built his career as a Confucian scholar official. Then the Civil War reached his home region of Hunan. The court authorized officials like Zheng to help organize local forces. That sounds like a temporary wartime measure. It would have consequences long after the war was over. Zheng began recruiting in Hunan, but he did not simply create another unit of the old Qing army. His force was built around personal relationships. Officers recruited men from their own areas. Those officers depended on commanders above them. The soldiers, in turn, depended heavily on the officers who recruited them, trained them, and made sure they were paid. This became the Hunan Army. Its structure was different from a modern national army where soldiers primarily belonged to an institution. Loyalty often ran through people. A soldier knew his officer. The officer knew his commander. And at the top of that network stood men like Zheng Guofan. There was another problem. Armies cost money. The Qing central government was already under huge pressure from war, lost revenue, and foreign indemnities. So much of the money needed to sustain these new forces had to be found closer to where they operated. Provincial officials became more important. Local taxes became more important. Merchants and regional financial networks became more important. The government in Beijing had not planned some grand decentralization of China. It was trying to survive. But survival was changing how power worked, and the new system began producing results. The Hunan army fought the Taiping across the Yangtze region for years. It was slow, it was expensive, and the war was brutal. But Zheng's forces gradually pushed toward the Taiping capital. Then, another man entered the story. Li Hongzhang. Li had also risen through the civil service examination system. He worked under Zeng and learned from the same wartime network. When the Taiping threatened Shanghai and the surrounding region, Li organized another regional force, the Huai Army. Once again, the pattern was similar: local recruitment, regional financing, a military organization closely connected to the officials who built and commanded it. By 1864, Qing forces had closed in on Nanjing. The city fell. The Taiping state was destroyed. After more than a decade of civil war, the Qing dynasty had survived. But look at what survival had required. The old central military system had not been enough. Beijing had depended on powerful officials in the provinces to recruit men, raise money, organize armies, and fight a war that threatened the dynasty itself. Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang had not weakened the Qing by rebelling against it. They had done the opposite. They had saved it. And that was exactly why they emerged from the war with so much influence. They now had experience commanding armies. They had relationships with officers. They had connections to provincial officials and merchants. They knew how to find money outside the normal central military system. The Qing survived. But the balance inside the state had changed. This is one of the biggest differences between the Chinese and Japanese stories. When Japan's old political order broke apart in the 1860s, the government that eventually emerged would spend years pulling military and fiscal power toward the center. China had just been pushed in the opposite direction by necessity. To defeat the Taiping, the Qing had relied more heavily on regional officials and the networks around them. And those same officials were about to become some of the most important people trying to modernize China. Li Hongzhang had learned something else during those years of war. The weapons used by British and French troops were not simply better versions of what China already had. They came from a different industrial world. Winning back Nanjing solved the immediate threat from the Taiping. It did nothing to solve that problem. Li would spend much of the rest of his career trying. Li Hongzhang had seen enough to know that the old military system could not stay the same. British and French troops had reached Beijing with steamships and modern artillery. The Taiping War had exposed another problem. Even inside China, many of the Qing's existing forces had struggled badly. So, Li started spending money on new weapons. European rifles and artillery were purchased. Arsenals appeared in places like Shanghai and Nanjing. Shipyards began building and repairing steam-powered vessels. Foreign engineers were hired, technical books were translated, and Chinese students and officers were sent overseas to learn how the machinery worked. This was not a small experiment hidden in one corner of the empire. By the 1870s and 1880s, modern military projects were appearing in several parts of China. Li's most ambitious project was in the north, the Beiyang Fleet. Over the years, China ordered warships from British and German yards, expanded naval bases, trained officers and sailors, and built facilities to support the fleet. Then came two ships that everyone noticed, Yuan and Yuan. They were built in Germany and displaced more than 7,000 tons each. Thick armor protected their hulls. Their main guns were enormous by the standards of East Asian navies at the time. When they arrived in China in the 1880s, they were not museum pieces or outdated copies of European ships. They were serious modern battleships. Japan did not yet have anything quite like them. And in 1891, China took them to Japan. The Beiyang fleet sailed into Japanese ports with Yuan and Yuan among its most impressive ships. Japanese officers came to look. That scene is worth remembering. 38 years earlier, Japan had watched Commodore Perry's black ships enter Edo Bay and realized it could not stop them. Now Japanese officers were standing beside their own harbor, looking up at enormous armored warships flying the Qing flag. China had spent decades being pushed around by foreign naval power. Here was proof that it had learned something. For anyone standing on that dock in 1891, the future did not look obvious. 3 years later, China and Japan would be at war. But nothing about Ding Yuan or Zhen Yuan made a Japanese victory look inevitable. And that is why simply saying China failed to modernize misses what actually happened. The Qing had modern guns, it had steamships, it had arsenals, it had officers who had studied foreign military methods. The question was no longer whether China could buy modern technology. It clearly could. The harder part was keeping all of it working. A ship like Ding Yuan required much more than the money used to purchase it. Its crew had to keep training. Its engines had to be maintained. Coal and ammunition had to be stocked. Damaged machinery needed spare parts. Dockyards needed skilled workers. And as naval technology improved, yesterday's expensive battleship could lose its advantage surprisingly quickly. Li had to keep finding money for all of that. He also had to do it inside the political system that had emerged from the wars of the previous decades. The Beiyang fleet was the strongest and most prestigious Qing fleet, but it was not simply one part of a fully integrated national navy like we would imagine today. Other parts of China had their own fleets, arsenals, commanders, and budgets. Li's power base was in the north. Other officials had projects of their own elsewhere. That arrangement had actually helped China move. Li did not have to wait for every province in the empire to modernize at the same speed before buying a battleship or building an arsenal. If he could secure the money and political support, he could get something built. The result was visible. Modern guns appeared. Modern factories appeared. Modern warships appeared. But a war would eventually ask all of those projects to work together. That was a different test. By the early 1890s, Ding Yuan and Zhen Yuan were still formidable. The problem was that Japan had not spent the previous decade standing still. Its navy kept expanding. New ships entered service. Crews kept training. The technology kept moving. A lead bought in the 1880s had to be paid for again in the 1890s, and the same problem existed beyond the navy. A modern rifle does not tell you whether an army can move quickly. A modern cannon does not tell you whether ammunition will arrive when it is needed. An expensive ship sitting in a harbor does not tell you how several fleets will coordinate once a real war begins. None of that had been tested yet. In 1891, the Beiyang fleet could enter a Japanese harbor and look powerful. That part was real. What nobody standing on the dock could see was how those ships would perform once a war demanded money, repairs, ammunition, soldiers, transport, and decisions far beyond the harbor. Japan had spent the same decades preparing for that possibility, but its story had started with a very different political crisis. The break in Japan began in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry entered Edo Bay with 4 American warships. Japan had restricted most foreign contact for more than 2 centuries, but the country was still divided among the Tokugawa shogunate and hundreds of regional domains. Each domain had its own administration, its own revenue, and its own samurai forces. Perry's ships exposed the weakness of that arrangement almost immediately. The shogunate could refuse his demands. What it could not do was confidently force those ships to leave. The following year, the shogunate agreed to open Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships. Other Western powers soon demanded similar agreements. The pressure from outside quickly became a political fight inside Japan. Some wanted the foreigners expelled. Others believed Japan had no choice but to learn from them. Powerful domains were already challenging the Tokugawa government, and the question of how to deal with the West became tied to a much older question over who should rule the country. The conflict eventually turned into civil war. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed. A new government formed around the young Meiji emperor. But overthrowing the shogun was the easy part. The men behind the new government had won with the help of powerful domains such as Satsuma and Choshu. Those domains still had their own leaders, revenues, officials, and armed men. A government in Tokyo could call itself national. That did not mean the country was actually being run as one. So, the new government started dismantling the system that had brought it to power. In 1871, the domains were abolished. The daimyo lost their independent governments, and their territories were reorganized into prefectures, controlled from the center. For families that had ruled the same areas for generations, this was enormous. The new government was not asking local rulers to modernize themselves. It was taking away much of the political structure that had made them independent in the first place. That same year, Japan sent some of its most important political figures overseas. The Iwakura mission left Japan in late 1871 and spent nearly 2 years traveling through the United States and Europe. They went into factories. They visited schools and shipyards. They studied railways, armies, government offices, industrial cities, and political institutions. They had also hoped to renegotiate the unequal treaties imposed on Japan. They failed. Western governments did not yet regard Japan as an equal, so the delegation spent the rest of the journey looking closely at the countries that were refusing them. What they saw was difficult to separate into neat categories. A factory depended on transport, money, engineers, and trained workers. An army depended on taxation, officers, supply, and administration. The point was not simply to admire Western technology. They were trying to understand what kind of state could produce it. After the mission returned, Japan kept turning what its officials had seen abroad into institutions at home. Railway construction accelerated, modern education expanded, industry and military production grew, while the central government became increasingly capable of collecting taxes and directing resources toward national projects. None of this happened smoothly. There were rebellions and political resistance. Former samurai lost privileges they had held for generations, and some reforms had to be changed repeatedly. But by the 1880s, Japan had something it had not possessed when Perry arrived: a central government that could raise taxes across the country, conscript soldiers, organize national military forces, and direct resources toward the same strategic goals. By the 1880s, the changes were visible almost everywhere. Railways crossed land that had once belonged to different domains. Taxes from those regions increasingly flowed into the same national government. Young men from different parts of Japan served in the same army. Tokyo could direct military and industrial projects far beyond the old boundaries of the domains. China was modernizing too. Its arsenals and ships made that impossible to deny. But much of that work had grown through the powerful regional networks created during the Taiping War. In Japan, the political upheaval of the 1860s had allowed the new government to weaken many of the old regional structures instead. For years, that difference could remain hidden behind uniforms, factories, and warships. In 1891, Japanese officers stood beside Yuan and Yuan and saw a Chinese navy that looked anything but obsolete. 3 years later, those ships would meet Japan under very different circumstances. In 1894, a major rebellion broke out in Korea. The Korean government requested Qing assistance. China sent troops. Japan sent troops as well. Once both armies were in Korea, neither government wanted to be the one that backed down. War followed. This was not supposed to be an easy Japanese victory. China was vastly larger. The Qing had modern arsenals and imported weapons. Li Hongzhang had spent years building the Beiyang fleet, including the heavily armored Yuan and Yuan. Anyone looking only at the 2 largest Chinese battleships could reasonably wonder whether Japan had picked a fight with the wrong country. The first major encounters quickly changed that impression. On land, Japanese forces drove Qing troops out of Korea and pushed north. At sea, the 2 navies met near the mouth of the Yalu River in September of 1894. The battle lasted for hours. Yuan and Yuan proved just how tough they were. Japanese shells struck them repeatedly, but the heavy ironclads were extremely difficult to sink. The problem was that a fleet is not judged by how much punishment its two largest ships can absorb. Japanese ships generally moved faster and operated with better coordination. Their rapid-firing guns allowed them to pour shells into Chinese vessels at a much higher rate. Several Qing ships were lost or badly damaged. The Beiyang fleet was not completely destroyed at the Yalu, but it lost the ability to control what happened next. Japan kept advancing. Its army crossed into Qing territory and captured key positions on the Liaodong Peninsula. The surviving Beiyang ships eventually withdrew to their fortified base at Weihaiwei. In early 1895, Japanese forces attacked the base from land and sea. The fortifications had been built mainly to protect the fleet from an enemy approaching from the water. Japanese troops came around from the landward side, seized positions overlooking the harbor, and trapped the fleet inside. By February, resistance had collapsed. The Beiyang fleet that Li Hongzhang had spent years building was effectively finished. Under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Qing recognized the end of its old position in Korea, ceded Taiwan and the Penghu Islands to Japan, and agreed to pay an enormous indemnity. The amount placed another major burden on Qing finances. Put the two dates next to each other. In 1853, American warships entered Edo Bay, and Japan could not make them leave. 42 years later, Japan was imposing treaty terms on China, and China had not gone into that war with wooden ships and ancient cannon. Yuan and Yuan had survived hours of Japanese fire at the Yalu. The Beiyang fleet had modern ships, trained crews, bases, and imported weapons. Yet the campaign kept moving against it. At the Yalu, several Chinese ships were lost, while the two great ironclads remained afloat. At Weihaiwei, the surviving fleet was trapped after Japanese troops approached its base from land. The war had forced things that looked separate in peacetime to work together. Fleet movements depended on what happened to the army. A naval base depended on the territory around it. Ships that survived one battle still had to be repaired, supplied, and sent back out. By early 1895, Japan had handled that chain better. The result shocked China for a reason that defeat by Britain had not. Britain was the world's leading industrial power. Japan had been forced open only a generation earlier. Now, Japan had beaten China. Other powers saw the result too, and almost immediately, they began testing how much more they could take. The answer came almost immediately. Under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, Japan had forced the Qing to hand over the Liaodong Peninsula. That would have given Japan a major foothold on the coast of northeast China, including access to the area around Port Arthur. Then, Russia, France, and Germany stepped in. They pressured Japan to return Liaodong. Japan had just defeated China, but it was not yet ready to risk a confrontation with three major European powers. So, it backed down. For the Qing court, that looked like a rare piece of good news. A territory lost in war had been returned. The relief did not last long. Russia had been one of the countries telling Japan that its possession of Liaodong threatened peace in East Asia. A few years later, Russia obtained a lease over part of the same peninsula and established itself at Port Arthur. The European powers had not intervened because they were determined to protect Chinese territory. They were deciding who would control it. Germany soon found its opportunity in Shandong. In 1897, 2 German missionaries were killed there. Germany responded by sending warships and occupying Jiaozhou Bay. The Qing was pressured into granting Germany a long-term lease around the bay, together with railway and mining rights in Shandong. Britain watched Russia move into Port Arthur and Germany into Shandong and demanded more of its own. In 1898, it obtained a lease over Wei Highway. That same year, Britain greatly expanded the territory under its control around Hong Kong through the lease of the new territories. France secured a leased territory at Guangzhou Yuan in southern China and pushed for greater influence in areas close to French Indochina. China was not formally divided into colonies like much of Africa. The Qing government still existed, and most of the country remained under Chinese administration. But foreign powers were carving out increasingly important areas where their commercial, military, and political influence came first. The competition also moved inland. Railways mattered because whoever financed and built them could influence where trade moved and how quickly troops could travel. Mining rights mattered because coal and minerals fed modern industry. Foreign loans mattered because the Qing increasingly needed money after repeated wars and indemnities. A government that had already lost control of important ports was now bargaining over who could build railways, open mines, lend it money, and operate inside different parts of the country. And all of this accelerated after 1895. Japan had shown that Qing weakness was not something only Britain could exploit. Inside China, the reaction was explosive. In northern China, anger toward foreign influence, missionaries, and Chinese Christian communities helped feed a popular movement that became known in English as the Boxers. Many of its members practiced martial and religious rituals and believed those practices could protect them from foreign weapons. The Qing court was deeply divided over what to do. Officials who had dealt with foreign armies understood how dangerous a direct confrontation could become. Others saw the Boxers as a force that might be turned against foreigners who had spent years taking more rights from China. By 1900, the crisis had reached Beijing. Boxer violence spread. Foreign diplomats and civilians were trapped inside the capital, and the Qing court eventually declared war on the foreign powers. 8 states sent forces into China. The expedition included troops from Japan, Russia, Britain, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. They fought their way toward Beijing. The Qing army and Boxer forces failed to stop them. The imperial court fled the capital. Foreign troops entered Beijing again. Under the Boxer Protocol, the Qing agreed to pay an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, with interest stretching the burden over decades. By 1900, the Qing had reached a point that another arsenal or another imported warship could no longer solve. The court had spent decades trying to strengthen China without changing too much of the political order underneath it. That approach had produced real results. It had also reached its limits. After foreign troops entered Beijing again, the court began preparing changes that went far beyond the old self-strengthening projects. This time, the reforms would reach into the institutions that produced China's officials, officers, and political elite. And once those institutions began to change, the Qing would discover a new problem. Reform could strengthen China without necessarily strengthening the dynasty. After the disaster of 1900, the Qing court began touching institutions it had avoided changing for decades. The earlier self-strengthening projects had concentrated heavily on ships, weapons, arsenals, and factories. Now the court went further. New schools expanded. More students were sent abroad. The army was reorganized around new-style units. Government offices were reworked, and the court began talking seriously about constitutional reform. Then, in 1905, the Qing abolished the imperial civil service examination. That decision reached much deeper into Chinese society than buying another battleship. For centuries, the examination system had given educated men a route into government. A student could spend years studying the Confucian classics, pass a series of examinations, and enter the bureaucracy. Very few succeeded. But the path was clear. If a young man wanted status, a government career, and a place inside the political order, the dynasty offered him a way to pursue it. In 1905, that path disappeared. The Qing had good reasons for ending it. A government trying to survive in the 20th century needed people who understood engineering, finance, foreign languages, modern law, diplomacy, and military science. The old examinations had never been designed to produce them. New schools were supposed to. But those schools changed more than the subjects students learned. They changed what students were exposed to. Thousands of Chinese students went overseas. One of the most popular destinations was Japan. The choice made sense. It was close. Travel was cheaper than going to Europe or the United States. And Japanese universities and military schools offered access to modern subjects through a language and intellectual environment Chinese students could navigate more easily. But there was something else waiting for them in Japan. They could look around. Railways, modern schools, factories, a conscript army, a parliament, government ministries, and the country building all of this was the same Japan that Perry had forced open only a few decades earlier. China had just lost a war to it. For a young Chinese student in Tokyo, Japan itself had become part of the lesson. Many also encountered political ideas that went far beyond technical modernization: constitutional government, nationalism, republicanism, revolution. The Qing was paying to train some of the people China needed for the future. A number of those students returned wondering whether that future still needed the Qing. The military reforms created an even more immediate version of the same problem. After 1900, the government expanded the new army. These soldiers used modern rifles. They trained under modern drill. Their officers came from a different educational world than much of the old banner and green standard establishment. Hubei became one of the most important centers of this new military system. Revolutionary organizations noticed. They began recruiting among the soldiers. The result was an extraordinary situation. The Qing had spent decades trying to create better trained troops. Now revolutionary cells existed inside some of the units it had trained. By 1911, tension was rising well beyond the army. The court had promised constitutional reform, but many provincial elites thought Beijing was moving too slowly. Newspapers and political associations had created a much wider political conversation. Provincial assemblies gave local elites more room to organize. Then, a railway dispute pulled another group into direct conflict with the government. Railway projects had been expanding across China. Some had been financed partly with money raised from local investors. In 1911, the Qing government decided to nationalize several important railway projects and continue construction with the help of foreign-backed loans. In Sichuan, people who had invested money into the local railway did not see this as an abstract economic policy. They believed something they had paid for was being taken away from them. Local elites, merchants, investors, and other supporters organized the railway protection movement. The dispute grew. Protests spread. The Qing government sent troops toward Sichuan to restore order. Some of those troops came from Hubei. That mattered because revolutionary groups inside the Hubei New Army were already preparing for an uprising. They had a plan. They were not supposed to launch it in early October. Then, someone made a mistake. On October 9, 1911, revolutionaries in Hankou were handling explosives when one accidentally went off. Police searched the building. They found weapons and documents connected to the revolutionary network. Suddenly, the people whose names appeared in those records had a much more immediate concern than whether their uprising was ready. If they waited, they could be arrested. The timetable collapsed. The next evening, new army soldiers in Wuchang mutinied. They seized military positions. Qing officials fled. Within a surprisingly short time, the rebels controlled the city. Even the leadership had to be improvised. Many senior revolutionary figures were not there. So, the rebels turned to Li Yuanhong, a Qing new army officer who had not planned to lead the uprising. They pushed him into becoming the head of the new military government. Nothing about the start looked carefully staged. An accidental explosion had exposed the organization. The uprising began earlier than planned. Its senior leadership was incomplete. And yet, it worked. That changed what everyone else could see. A provincial capital had broken from the Qing, and Beijing had not immediately taken it back. News traveled quickly through newspapers and telegraph lines. Political groups in other provinces no longer had to imagine whether open resistance was possible. They had an example. Province after province began declaring independence from the Qing government. At that point, Beijing's problem was no longer one rebel city. The political structure around it was starting to come apart, and the dynasty now turned to the strongest modern army it still had, the Beiyang army. That meant Yuan Shikai. Yuan had spent years building and commanding the Beiyang military system in northern China. The Qing court had pushed him out of power earlier. Now it needed him back. There is a familiar pattern here. During the Taiping War, the dynasty had survived by depending on Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang because they controlled armies the old system could not easily replace. Half a century later, it was again turning to a powerful commander whose military value gave him enormous political leverage. But Yuan's position was even stronger. He could use the Beiyang army against the Revolutionaries. He could bargain with the Qing court. And he could negotiate with the Republican leaders forming a government in the south. The Revolutionaries had reasons to talk as well. The Beiyang army was probably the strongest modern military force in China. Trying to destroy it outright could turn the revolution into a much longer civil war. So, negotiations began to matter almost as much as fighting. A deal gradually took shape. If Yuan could secure the abdication of the Qing emperor, the Republican side was prepared to accept him as president of the new republic. For the Qing court, the alternatives were narrowing quickly. Province after province had already broken away. The army it most needed belonged politically to a man who was negotiating with both sides. On February 12, 1912, the child emperor Puyi abdicated. More than 260 years of Qing rule were over. The Wuchang uprising had begun only about 4 months earlier. Its speed makes the fall of the Qing look almost sudden. It wasn't. By 1911, China already had new army units filled with men trained outside the old military system. Students had returned from overseas with political ideas the court had never intended to promote. Provincial assemblies and political organizations gave local elites new ways to coordinate. Newspapers and telegraph lines could carry news of a successful uprising from one province to another in hours rather than months. And when the dynasty needed its strongest northern army, it had to bargain with Yuan Shikai to use it. Many of these institutions had been created or expanded because the Qing was trying to strengthen the country. In the final crisis, they also gave people outside the dynasty far more ability to act. The Qing was gone. But the question we started with was larger than why one dynasty collapsed. Go back to Japan in 1891. Ding Yuan and Zhen Yuan were sitting in the harbor under Qing flags, while Japanese officers came aboard to inspect them. At that moment, the ending of this story was not obvious. China had spent decades importing technology and building new military industries. The Beiyang fleet was one of the most visible results. Japan had been doing the same kind of learning. What separated them was what had happened around those projects. In Japan, the shock from the West helped bring down the Tokugawa order. The government that emerged after 1868 abolished the domains, built new national taxes, created a conscript army, and gradually pushed its authority deeper into the country. It faced rebellions and resistance while doing it. But the direction remained clear. More military and financial power was moving toward the new central government. China's 19th century followed another sequence. The first foreign defeats were followed almost immediately by the Taiping War. The Qing survived because men such as Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang were able to recruit armies and find money through powerful regional networks. Later, many of China's most important modernization projects grew through those same networks. That did not stop China from building impressive things. It explains how Ding Yuan and Zhen Yuan could exist in the first place. But China was modernizing while dealing with the political structure created by civil war, another foreign invasion, indemnities, and growing pressure from outside powers. There was rarely a clean starting point. Every crisis left something behind for the next reform to deal with. That is why 1895 mattered so much. The war with Japan took two countries that had both spent decades learning from the industrial world and put their reforms under the same pressure. China's strongest ships could fight. They could take hits. They could frighten Japanese officers in a harbor. But a war lasted longer than a harbor visit. Once armies, fleets, bases, transport, finance, and political decisions had to keep working together, the difference became much harder to hide. After defeat, China did not stop reforming. It eventually went much further. The Qing changed schools, rebuilt armies, abolished the examination system, sent students abroad, and began preparing constitutional reforms. Those changes helped create the people and institutions a modern China needed. They also changed the political world underneath the dynasty. By 1911, some of the soldiers, students, provincial leaders, and political organizations created during this period were already capable of acting without waiting for Beijing. The dynasty fell only months after the uprising at Wuchang. So the answer is not that Japan modernized while China refused. China was changing throughout the 19th century. The two countries were changing under very different conditions. Japan's political revolution gave its new government a chance to rebuild much of the state before its decisive confrontation with China. The Qing often had to modernize while trying to keep the state together after the last war or rebellion had already changed it. That difference was hard to see in 1891. 4 years later, it was visible on the battlefield. 21 years later, the Qing dynasty no longer existed. China's attempt to build a modern state continued long after it was gone.